March 2001. A quiet home in Balbriggan, just north of Dublin. The air was still. The curtains were drawn. And at the bottom of a staircase, a young woman's body lay lifeless, wrapped neatly in a duvet. Her face turned toward the wall. The voice that rang through the emergency line was trembling. It belonged to her husband. He told him his wife had fallen, that he had found her there, that she wasn't breathing. Paramedics rushed to the scene. Within minutes, they confirmed what he already knew. Mary Gough was gone. She was just 27, 6 months into a new marriage. A marriage that, on the outside, seemed full of hope, warmth, and plans of future. Friends described her as generous, bright, someone who could light up a room without saying a word. Her family adored her. Her husband, Colin Whelan, was seen as intelligent, quiet, thoughtful, devoted. But in the hours that followed, something didn't add up. Mary's injuries didn't look like the result of a fall. The marks on her body told a different story. Her neck showed pressure, compression. The kind of pressure you don't get from stairs. The kind of pressure that takes time, that requires intent and control. When detectives quietly began their inquiry, they found something buried deep in the digital logs of a shared home computer. A browser history filled with chilling searches. How to break a person's neck. How to cause death without leaving obvious injuries. How to make murder look like an accident. The man who had wept over her body had studied how to end her life. And when the Gardaí closed in, he did something few expected. He disappeared, left behind a note, abandoned everything. His passport, his bank cards, his past. It was assumed he had ended his own life. But he hadn't. For months, he lived among tourists in a foreign country under a new name, working a job, drinking in pubs, watching headlines about the woman he had married and murdered. He thought he had gotten away with it. But justice doesn't vanish that easily. Not when a family refuses to stop asking questions. Not when a man who planned a perfect killing makes one mistake and is seen by someone who never forgot his face. Tonight, we take you back into a case that stunned Ireland. A murder hidden beneath a wedding ring. A killer who rehearsed every step. And a woman who deserved far more than a quiet burial and a false goodbye. This is not a mystery. This is not a question of guilt. This is a story of betrayal, calculation, and the cold execution of someone who trusted with her whole heart. This is the Mary Gough case. Mary Gough was 27. She had recently married the man she believed she would grow old with. Her life was simple, steady, rooted in love, family, and the promise of something lasting. She lived in a modest home in Balbriggan, just outside the hum of Dublin City. She wasn't famous. She didn't make headlines in life. But in death, her name would never be forgotten. In the early morning hours of March 2001, emergency services arrived to find her lifeless at the base of the stairs. Her husband, Colin Whelan, said he found her like that, said she had fallen, said he had tried everything. And for a moment, it worked. For a moment, he was seen as a grieving husband, heartbroken, shaken, in shock. Friends brought him food. Family offered prayers. He gave a eulogy. He buried his wife. And he cried. But then the question started. Why had he wrapped her in a duvet? Why were there marks on her body that didn't match a fall? Why was her neck bruised, symmetrical, calculated tight? And why, on their shared computer, had someone spent days researching how to end a life without being caught? When investigators dug deeper, what they found was no longer grief. It was preparation, precision, and silence. Because just before the noose of justice could close around him, Colin Whelan vanished. He faked a suicide, left a note, abandoned his identity, and with it, every trace of the man he had been. For months, he lived as someone else in a foreign country. No family, no friends, no past, just a murderer hiding in plain sight. This isn't just a story about a marriage that ended in tragedy. It's a story about control, about premeditation, about a man who rehearsed death like a performance, and about the moment it all unraveled. Because of one search bar and one stranger's memory, the evidence didn't just point to murder. It screamed it. and every detail brought investigators closer to the truth that Mary never had the chance to tell. This is a case that exposes just how far someone will go to maintain the illusion of innocence. A case where the killer didn't run from guilt. He tried to erase himself entirely. Mary Gough was born in Ireland in 1973. She grew up surrounded by a close-knit family who describe her as someone who felt more like sunshine than a person. Bright, witty, and fiercely loyal, Mary didn't need the spotlight. She just needed those she loved close by. Her interests were simple. She loved animals. She loved laughter. And she had a quiet confidence that made others feel safe, even if she never fully showed when she was hurting. In her late 20s, she met Colin Whalen. He was intelligent, educated, measured in how he spoke. He didn't command a room, but he didn't need to. He gave the impression of stability, reliability, and that, for Mary, felt like a foundation she could trust. Friends say she fell for him gradually, but deeply. There were no grand gestures, no whirlwind romance, just comfort, consistency, quiet plans. They moved in together, got engaged, married. By all accounts, it was a clean start. Two lives merging under one roof in Balbriggan. The house was modest but warm. Mary was said to be settling into married life with joy and optimism. She spoke about the future, about travel, about children. There were dinner parties, phone calls to her mother, evenings in front of the television. But in hindsight, some things didn't sit right. A few close friends would later reflect that Colin could be withdrawn, moody, even, that he didn't like surprises, that when things didn't go as planned, his voice tightened and his answers shortened. One family member recalled an odd comment Mary had made in passing, that sometimes she felt she had to walk on eggshells, that her husband could be cold but not cruel, that when he got quiet, she didn't know what he was thinking, and that made her nervous. But these were glimpses, just flashes, the kind of things people dismiss in the early months of marriage, when you're still adjusting, still hoping. Besides, she loved him, and she believed he loved her. In public, they were like any newlyweds, polite, affectionate, ordinary. He held her hand. She smiled at him with ease. Nothing about their life or their relationship stood out as dangerous. But when investigators would later unravel the full story, they'd come back to this time, these quiet days in Balbriggan, and ask themselves a question no one saw coming. Were the signs there all along, and did no one notice? Because something was already broken beneath the surface. And Mary, who always believed the best in people, was living with a man who had already made a decision, one that would change everything. March 16th, 2001. Just before sunrise, a 999 call came through to emergency services in Dublin. The voice on the line was male. He sounded panicked, short of breath. He gave his name. Colin Whalen. He said his wife had fallen down the stairs, that she wasn't moving, that he couldn't feel a pulse. Paramedics were dispatched immediately. By the time they arrived at the house in Balbriggan, Mary Gough had no signs of life. She was lying at the base of the staircase. Still, quiet. But what struck the first responders wasn't just that she was gone. It was how she had been found. Mary wasn't sprawled or crumpled as one might expect from a sudden fall. Her body had been wrapped carefully in a duvet. Tucked, neatly, her face was turned slightly away. There were no visible signs of trauma consistent with an accident, not the kind paramedics expected. But still, they followed protocol. She was transported, and within hours, she was pronounced dead. Her husband told investigators he had found her like that he panicked, that he wrapped her up while trying to revive her, that maybe she had gotten up during the night and slipped. There was grief in his voice, trembling in his hands. He told family she was the love of his life. He cried during the funeral. He held her mother and whispered that he'd never recover. But behind the scenes, quiet questions were forming. The position of her body, the flatness of the scene, the calmness of the house, and the bruises. That didn't look like the result of a fall. An autopsy was ordered. When the report came in, it shattered the version of events Colin had so desperately tried to protect. Mary Gough had not died from blunt force trauma. She had been strangled. The bruising around her neck was symmetrical, deep, uniform, the kind created by hands, not a stair railing. Her face bore petechiae, tiny broken blood vessels around her eyes and mouth. Her tongue had been pressed against the back of her teeth. There was also a faint pattern of bruising across her chest, defensive marks, and a subtle abrasion across her jawline, like someone had held her still while applying pressure. This wasn't a tragic fall. This wasn't an accident. And this wasn't a moment of panic. This was murder. And the man who had called for help, the man who had spoken of love and loss, was now the only suspect. The Gough launched a quiet investigation, determined not to tip him off. Behind closed doors, detectives were building a timeline, pulling phone records, reviewing computer logs, interviewing neighbors, waiting, watching. But what they didn't know yet was that Colin Whalen wasn't just hiding a crime. He was already preparing for something worse. He wasn't planning a defense. He was planning a disappearance. The staircase didn't kill Mary Gough. Her husband did. And soon he would vanish too, as Mary's autopsy confirmed the unthinkable, that her life had been taken deliberately. Detectives turned their full attention to the only person who had been with her that night, her husband, Colin Whalen. On the outside, Colin had been cooperative, calm. He answered their questions, repeated the same story, that he found her at the bottom of the stairs, that he panicked, that he tried to help. But behind that steadiness, something was off. Detectives noticed how controlled his answers were. There was no deviation, no struggle to remember, no gaps in memory, just repetition and silence. As Gough began a formal investigation, they quietly searched the home. What they found shifted the tone from suspicion to certainty. On the shared computer, hidden in a folder buried deep within subdirectories, was a browsing history that read like a murder manual. How to kill someone with your hands. How long it takes to strangle a person. Make a fall look accidental. Signs of asphyxiation after death. These searches hadn't been made in a rush. They were spaced out, calculated. Days before Mary's death, he had been researching, not panicking, not grieving, planning. They checked timestamps. Colin Whalen had been studying how to get away with murder, but it didn't end there. The timeline of events, the one Colin had given them, started to fall apart. He claimed to have gone to bed with Mary around 10 p.m., but neighbors reported seeing lights on hours later. A hallway light was left on through the night, despite Colin saying he'd been asleep. Small things, but they began to add up, and when Gough asked to speak with him again, he was gone. Not missing, not delayed, vanished. A note was found in his home. It was brief, vague, and haunting. "I'm sorry. I can't face this." His passport was left behind. So was his phone. His bank accounts froze with no activity. For a brief time, Ireland believed Colin Whalen had taken his own life. That guilt had swallowed him whole. That Mary's story would die with him. But detectives weren't convinced. The man they were tracking had studied detail. He had mapped out a clean escape from a marriage. He had researched methods, timing, and risk. It wasn't a stretch to believe he had mapped out a clean escape from justice. Weeks passed, then months. No sightings, no leads, no trace. The case went cold, but not silent, because the people who loved Mary refused to forget, and the people tasked with finding her killer refused to give up. Colin Whalen had taken a life, and then, with the same steady hands, he disappeared. He planned the murder and his own vanishing act. For over a year, Colin Whalen was gone. No digital trail, no bank activity, no voice at the other end of the phone. To some, it appeared he had taken his own life, just as his note had suggested. But for the Gough, something didn't sit right. He had faked once before. Why not again? Investigators began working backward. If someone had staged a murder as an accident, if that same person left behind just enough to suggest a suicide, then perhaps that was a plan all along. Not escape from guilt, escape from consequence. A red notice was quietly issued through Interpol, but months passed, and then the unthinkable happened. July 2002, Majorca, a crowded Spanish tourist town. Sunny, vibrant, anonymous. It was here that a woman from Ireland, on holiday, saw someone familiar walking past a cafe. She froze. The face was leaner, hair thinner, but she knew. She had seen his picture on news reports. She had heard his name whispered in disbelief, and she alerted the authorities. Within days, Spanish police moved in. The man she pointed out was living under a false name. He had secured employment, built a daily routine, lived quietly among strangers, pretending to be someone else entirely. It was Colin Whalen. When they arrested him, he didn't resist. He didn't run. He didn't deny who he was. He just nodded. He knew it was over. Back in Ireland, the news spread like wildfire. The man who murdered his wife, who stood at her funeral, who wrote a suicide note and vanished, had been living freely, in full view under the sun, for over a year. Extradition followed. And so did questions. How had he pulled it off? Had someone helped him escape? How had he funded it? And most disturbingly, was Mary Gough truly the only victim? Because the level of planning, of patience, of emotional detachment, it all suggested something more, something colder. Internet forums buzzed with speculation. Amateur sleuths began pulling at every thread in Colin Whalen's past. People who had worked with him, people who remembered strange behavior, moments he had withdrawn, comments he had made years before Mary's death that, at the time, meant nothing. Some wondered if there were other signs, other attempts, a pattern. No evidence has ever confirmed a second victim, but those who study the case closely remain unsure, because this wasn't a man who snapped in a moment of rage. This was a man who rehearsed murder, who predicted investigators' every move, who constructed not just an alibi, but a disappearance. And if he hadn't been spotted by pure chance, if that Irish tourist hadn't looked twice, he may never have faced justice at all. He almost got away with murder, literally. For years after Mary Gough's murder, the man who stole her life and tried to erase his own finally stood before an Irish court. Colin Whalen was brought back to Dublin under tight security. There were no reporters allowed in the courtroom, no photographs, no spectacle. He entered a plea of guilty. There was no trial, no contest, no explanations, just silence and a single word: guilty. It was the first time he had admitted what everyone already knew, that he had murdered his wife in their own home, that he had pretended to mourn her, that he had buried her and then disappeared. The court sentenced him to life in prison. But for Mary's family, there was no celebration, because justice, while necessary, does not heal, and no sentence, no matter how severe, could bring her back. In the quiet of that courtroom, her brothers read victim impact statements, their voices breaking, their hands trembling. They spoke of what had been taken, of birthdays missed, of weddings Mary would never attend, of her laugh, her future, the whole left behind. And then, after the hearing, something unexpected. A box. It contained some of Mary's personal belongings, things that had been held in evidence since the investigation began. Her wedding ring, a favorite piece of clothing, a photo of her and Colin smiling on holiday. Things that once carried love, now tainted by the knowledge of what he'd done. Her family accepted them with shaking hands, because they were the last physical traces of her life. But in a way, even in prison, Colin Whalen had kept them from her family for years. Even behind bars, he controlled pieces of her memory. The courtroom emptied. Cameras clicked outside. Headlines moved on. But for those who knew Mary, there was no moving on, only learning to live with absence, with questions, with rage, and with the unbearable truth that a man who once promised to protect her had taken everything from her and nearly gotten away with it. Mary Gough was 27 years old. She had a future. She had family. She had love in her heart and trust in her home. And she had no idea that the person sleeping beside her was planning her death. We often imagine danger as something loud, sudden, violent. But sometimes it wears a smile. It says, "I love you." It makes tea. It blends in. And by the time it reveals itself, it's already too late. Mary's story is more than a tragedy. It's a warning that control, manipulation, and danger can exist behind the most ordinary of doors, that even the most private spaces can become crime scenes, and that every suspicious death deserves attention, regardless of who the witness is. Colin Whalen didn't have a history of violence. He didn't lash out. He didn't yell in public or threaten in front of witnesses. What he had was control. He planned, he studied, and when he finally acted, he wrapped his violence in silence and structure. But the system didn't stop asking questions. Investigators trusted their instincts. They saw through the grief, and they gave Mary back her voice. Her name didn't vanish. It echoed. Mary Gough, a woman who loved deeply, a woman who trusted completely, a woman who was betrayed in the cruelest, quietest way. And today, more than 2 decades later, her case still raises questions that echo far beyond her home in Balbriggan. What if he hadn't been caught? Would he have tried again with someone else? Did he truly stop with Mary? Or was this just the only time he was seen? How do we spot the red flags? When they don't come with bruises or screaming, when they come disguised as normal? When they're whispered between shared meals and polite smiles? Mary's story reminds us that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they sit at the dinner table. So now we ask you, do you believe justice was truly served in this case? What stood out most to you about Colin's behavior before and after the murder? And how many warning signs do we overlook simply because someone seems perfect? If her case leaves you with unease, let it. Because the most chilling part of the story is how close it came to being forgotten and how close he came to disappearing forever. If Mary's story left you thinking, if it stayed with you longer than you expected, then let that discomfort mean something. Because this isn't just a story about loss. It's about what happens when trust is broken in the most unimaginable way. On Dark Trail Files, we don't tell these stories for shock. We tell them because they matter, because someone should remember, because silence should never be the final word. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another case that demands attention. And if you're still thinking about Mary Gough, leave a comment, share your thoughts, ask the questions that still linger, because sometimes the only way to honor the truth is to keep asking why.